Please make me birth you a son." Obese Amish girl begged the giant mountain man. A freezing night. A lonely cabin in the Colorado mountains. An Amish girl, cast out by her own father, pounds on the door with trembling fists. When the giant mountain man opens it, her words slice through the snowstorm. "Please, make me birth you a son." But what begins as desperation sparks a battle neither of them expected. Whispers in town brand her a shame. A ruthless railroad agent sets his sights on the mountain man's land, and deep inside, both carry wounds too heavy to speak aloud. She offers him faith and firelight. He offers her shelter from the storm. Yet the world beyond that cabin is waiting to tear them apart. Will a woman once scorned as unwanted, and a man broken by grief, find the strength to stand against gossip, greed, and their own fears? Or will the mountains claim their hearts before love has a chance to live? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The wind howled outside Kevin Hale's cabin, driving snow against the frost-covered window panes. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn logs. Kevin's large frame filled the wooden chair as he watched his unexpected guest warm her hands around a tin cup of steaming tea. Elsbeth Yoder's cheeks still bore angry red patches of frostbite, but color was slowly returning to her face. Her plain dark dress and wool cape hung by the fire, dripping melted snow onto the plank floor. She'd wrapped herself in the woolen blanket Kevin had offered, though her shoulders remained tense beneath the rough fabric. "I know what you must think of me," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "An unmarried woman, traveling alone, making such an improper request." Her voice caught on the last words. Kevin shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. 5 years of solitude had left him ill-equipped for conversation, especially with a woman. "Reckon you'd best tell me what brought you here, Miss Yoder." Elsbeth's hands tightened around her cup. 2 days ago, I fled our settlement in Pennsylvania. My father. She drew a shaky breath. He arranged my marriage to a widower from another colony, a man I'd never met. Kevin noticed how she unconsciously touched her side, as if remembering a hurt. "Your father hurt you?" "With words, mostly." Elsbeth's voice grew smaller. "He said no man would want me, except one desperate enough to overlook my size. That I should be grateful anyone would take such damaged goods." A tear slid down her cheek, but she brushed it away quickly. "He traded me like livestock for lumber and horses." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Kevin felt anger stirring in his chest. Not at the woman before him, but at a father who would treat his daughter so cruelly. He'd seen that kind of meanness before, had no patience for it. "I prayed for guidance," Elsbeth continued. "Then I heard talk of mountain men living alone in these parts. I thought—" Her cheeks flushed deeper than the frostbite. "I thought if I could prove my worth, bear a son." She couldn't finish. Kevin stood and moved to add another log to the fire, giving himself time to steady his voice. "Miss Yoder, you're welcome to shelter here tonight, but what you're asking—" He shook his head. "Wouldn't be right." "Because of my size?" The hurt in her voice was raw. "No." Kevin turned to face her. "Because you deserve better than being anyone's breeding stock, even mine." The words came out gruffer than he'd intended, but they were honest. Elsbeth's shoulders slumped. In the firelight, Kevin could see dark circles under her eyes, the weariness of her desperate journey etched in every line of her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 25. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered. "I can't go back. They'll force me to marry him, or shun me for running away. Either way." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Kevin remembered his own first winter alone in this cabin after losing Sarah. The crushing weight of isolation, the endless silence broken only by wind and wolves. He'd nearly gone mad with it. "You'll stay tonight," he said firmly. "Get warm, get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out what's next." Elsbeth looked up at him, hope and wariness warring in her expression. "You're certain?" "Got a spare room. It ain't much, but it's warm." He gestured toward the narrow hallway. "Used to be my wife's sewing room." "Your wife?" Elsbeth asked softly. Kevin's jaw tightened. "She's gone. 5 years now." Understanding flickered in Elsbeth's eyes. She didn't press further, and Kevin was grateful for that. Instead, she clasped her hands together and bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she prayed in a whisper, "grant mercy to this household and its master. Show thy servant the path of righteousness, and give me strength to walk it." Her voice trembled, but held firm. Kevin hadn't prayed since Sarah died, had turned his back on God in his grief. But something in Elsbeth's simple faith stirred a long-buried ember in his soul. He remained silent, but bowed his head slightly in respect. When she finished her prayer, he showed her to the spare room. The space was small, but tidy, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. Sarah's old quilts still lay folded at the foot of the bed, untouched since the day she died. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Elsbeth said, standing in the doorway, "for your kindness to a stranger." Kevin nodded gruffly. "Get some rest, Miss Yoder. You're safe here." He returned to his chair by the fire, listening to the soft sounds of Elsbeth settling into the room. The wind continued to moan outside, but somehow the cabin felt less empty than it had in years. As snowflakes swirled past the windows, Kevin found himself wondering what tomorrow would bring, and why God had sent this unlikely visitor to his door on such a bitter winter's night. The fire burned low, and Kevin added another log, watching the flames catch and grow. In the spare room, he could hear Elsbeth's quiet prayers, her words too soft to make out, but their cadence somehow soothing in the darkness. For the first time in a long while, the silence of his cabin didn't feel quite so heavy. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Kevin stirred the embers in the pot-bellied stove. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Elsbeth emerging from the spare room, her hair neatly tucked beneath her cap, despite yesterday's ordeal. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said quietly, smoothing her wrinkled dress. Kevin nodded, adding kindling to the stove. "Thought I might show you around, Miss Yoder." "Small place, but you should know where things are." "I would like that." Her voice carried a hint of relief, as if she'd feared being turned out at dawn. Kevin led her through the cabin, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the door frames. "Main room here. Kitchen space yonder." He gestured to the rough-hewn logs that made up the walls, the sturdy beams overhead. "Loft up there's for storage, mostly." Elsbeth followed attentively, her eyes taking in every detail. The cabin was spare but solid, built to withstand the fierce mountain winters. When they reached the kitchen area, she noticed dirty dishes from the previous night. "Please, let me help with the morning chores," she offered, already reaching for a dish. "Don't have to," Kevin started, but she shook her head. "I want to earn my keep, Mr. Hale, even if just for today." He watched as she filled a basin with water, her movements determined despite obvious inexperience with his cabin's layout. When she reached for the soap, he noticed her hands, red, cracked, and bleeding from her journey through the cold. "Miss Yoder," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "let me see those hands." She hesitated, then held them out. The skin was raw, with several deep cracks across her palms and fingers. Without a word, Kevin retrieved a small tin of salve and clean cloth strips from a shelf. "Sarah, my wife, she'd make this salve," he explained, carefully applying the medicine to Elsbeth's wounds. "Good for frostbite and such." Elsbeth remained still as he wrapped the bandages, though tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," You ain't. Kevin tied off the last bandage. Hands need to heal before you take on any chores. They sat down to a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. The silence stretched between them until Elsbeth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My father said, he said I would die alone. She stared into her coffee cup. That God made me barren as punishment for my size. Her shoulders trembled. Sometimes I wonder if he was right. Kevin set down his cup with more force than necessary. No man's cruel words define any woman's worth, not even a father's. Elsbeth looked up, startled by the conviction in his voice. But how can you be sure? Because I've seen enough of this world to know better. His eyes met hers steadily. Man who'd say such things to his own daughter, he's the one needs judging, not you. After breakfast, Kevin went outside to chop wood. The rhythmic thunk of the axe filled the cold morning air. He was halfway through the pile when a sound caught his attention. Singing, soft and clear, coming from inside the cabin. The hymn was in Pennsylvania Dutch, but its reverent tone needed no translation. Kevin's axe stilled as the melody drifted through the winter air. It had been 5 years since any sound of worship had filled his cabin. The simple beauty of Elsbeth's voice stirred something in his chest that he thought had died with Sarah. He returned to his work, but more slowly now, letting the hymn wash over him as he split log after log. When the song ended, he pretended not to notice the silence that followed, though its absence felt keen. By supper time, clouds had gathered, promising more snow. Kevin showed Elsbeth how to work the stove, and together they prepared a simple stew. As they ate, he told her about the winter ahead, how deep the snow could get, what supplies they had stored. You're welcome to stay until spring, he said carefully. As a friend seeking shelter, nothing more. Elsbeth's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Then, unexpectedly, she gave a small, nervous laugh, the first he'd heard from her. The sound seemed to surprise them both. Thank you, she said, collecting herself. I don't deserve such kindness. Ain't about deserving, Kevin replied. Just about doing what's right. That evening, as fresh snow began to fall outside, they sat by the fire. Kevin mended a pair of worn boots, while Elsbeth darned a sock with her bandaged hands, insisting on making herself useful despite his protests. Thank you, she whispered into the comfortable silence. For everything. Kevin nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, while inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. The following morning dawned crisp and clear. Kevin hitched his 2 workhorses to the heavy wood sled, while Elsbeth wrapped herself in an extra woolen shawl he'd found in the trunk. The supply run to Pine Crossing couldn't wait. They needed flour, salt, and other staples that were running low. It's about 3 hours down to town, Kevin explained, helping her onto the sled. He tucked thick buffalo robes around her legs. Road's easier since the snow packed down. Elsbeth nodded, gripping the sled's edge as they started moving. The runners creaked against the snow, and their breath fogged in the winter air. Kevin sat beside her, his massive frame blocking much of the wind. The journey passed quietly, with Elsbeth occasionally humming hymns under her breath. As they descended from the highlands, the tree line thinned, revealing the sprawl of Pine Crossing below, a collection of wooden buildings strung along the main street, smoke rising from chimneys into the mountain air. Their arrival drew immediate attention. Townsfolk stopped on the boardwalk, turning to stare at the unusual pair, the giant mountain man they rarely saw, and the heavy-set Amish woman beside him. Whispers followed them down the street. Who's that with Hale? Plain folk by her dress. Lord above, she's a big one. Elsbeth's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes forward, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Kevin guided the sled to the hitching post outside the general store. As they climbed down, a drunk stumbled out of the saloon across the street. He squinted at them, then let out a harsh laugh. "Well, if it ain't Hale and his cow," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Kevin turned slowly, fixing the man with a stare cold enough to freeze water. The drunk's laughter died in his throat. He mumbled something and ducked back into the saloon. "Pay no mind," Kevin said quietly to Elsbeth, but she saw how his jaw clenched. Inside the general store, Elsbeth tried to focus on their task. She helped Kevin gather supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork, lamp oil. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined the dry goods, aware of the curious stares from other customers. Near the counter, she noticed two men in conversation. One wore a badge identifying him as the sheriff, the other a sharp Eastern suit that marked him as someone important. The suited man spoke in cultured tones about railroad business. "Mr. Markley," the shopkeeper greeted the suited man, "your usual tobacco?" "Yes, thank you," Markley replied, then paused as his gaze fell on Kevin. His lip curled slightly. He turned back to the sheriff, speaking in a lower voice, but Elsbeth caught fragments about prime depot land and mountain properties. Kevin seemed to sense the tension. He stepped between Elsbeth and Markley's line of sight, efficiently completing their purchase. The sheriff nodded politely to them as they left, but Markley merely sneered. The return journey felt longer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, and Elsbeth sat lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry if I've brought shame to your name," she said softly. "The way they stared, what they said." Kevin was quiet for a long moment, hands steady on the reins. "My reputation's already what it is," he said finally. 5 years alone in the mountains, folks talk plenty. I value honest work and honest words. Gossip ain't neither." Elsbeth glanced at his profile, stern against the darkening sky. "You're very kind, Mr. Hale." "Ain't kindness, just truth." They reached the cabin as evening approached. While Kevin tended to the horses, Elsbeth went inside, determination setting her shoulders straight. She had noticed his stores of lard and molasses while taking inventory. With the fresh flour they'd bought, she could at least make this small offering. The familiar motions of bread-making settled her nerves. She worked the dough with practiced hands, adding just enough molasses to sweeten it. The cabin filled with the aroma of baking bread as darkness fell outside. When Kevin came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, Elsbeth was just pulling the loaf from the oven. She set it on the table, uncertain. "It's not much," she said. "Just simple bread with molasses. I wanted to thank you for today." Kevin cut a thick slice, steam rising in the lamplight. He took a bite, and something in his expression shifted. A faint smile touched his lips. "My mother used to make bread like this," he said quietly. "When I was a boy in Kentucky." Elsbeth's heart lifted at his words, hope blooming warm in her chest. She cut herself a slice, and they ate together in comfortable silence as snow began to fall outside the window. The storm struck without warning. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing howling winds that rattled the cabin's shutters. Kevin and Elsbeth watched from the window as snow began falling in thick curtains, obscuring the world beyond their small shelter. "Looks like we're in for a spell," Kevin said, adding another log to the pot-bellied stove. "Could be 2 days, maybe more." Elsbeth nodded, drawing her shawl tighter. She'd seen such storms in Pennsylvania, but here in the mountains they felt wilder, more fierce. The wind moaned through the pine trees, sounding almost human. As morning stretched into afternoon, they settled into quiet tasks. Kevin retrieved his old snowshoes from the rafters, the rawhide webbing worn and frayed. He sat near the stove, working methodically to repair them with strips of fresh leather. Elsbeth noticed a pile of his clothes needing mending. "May I?" she asked, holding up a worn shirt with split seams. Kevin nodded. "Much obliged." She threaded her needle with practiced ease, her stitches neat and tiny, the way her mother had taught her. The familiar work soothed her nerves as the storm raged outside. "You've got skilled hands," Kevin observed, watching her work. "Mama said idle hands invite the devil's mischief," Elsbeth replied, then added softly, "though some said my only skill was taking up space." Kevin's hands stilled on the snowshoe. "Cruel words," he said, "from cruel hearts." The fire crackled, filling the thoughtful silence. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the door in its frame. "I lost someone, too," Kevin said suddenly, his voice rough. He kept his eyes on his work, but his hands had stopped moving. "My Clara. 5 winters past." Elsbeth's needle paused mid-stitch. She waited, sensing the weight of his words. "Avalanche caught us coming back from town. She was carrying our first." His jaw clenched. "I dug for hours. By the time I found her." He shook his head. "That's when I came up here. Couldn't bear to be around folks anymore." Elsbeth's heart ached for him. She understood now. The silence in his cabin. The solitude he'd wrapped around himself like armor. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Kevin nodded once, sharp and quick. He resumed working on the snowshoe, but his movements were less steady. The day wore on. Elsbeth stirred the stew pot hanging over the fire, adding dried herbs she'd found in Kevin's stores. The familiar task gave her courage to speak. "They said I was barren," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Back home. Said no man would want damaged goods." She swallowed hard. "That's why Father tried to trade me, like livestock." Kevin looked up, his eyes dark with anger. "A woman's worth ain't in her womb," he said firmly. "It's in her courage, her heart." He met her gaze. "You walked 2 days through mountain snow rather than let them break you. That's worth more than any number of babies." Tears pricked Elsbeth's eyes at his words. To hide them, she began to sing softly, an old hymn about God's mercy. The melody filled the cabin, rising above the storm's fury. To her surprise, Kevin began to hum along, his deep voice joining hers on the chorus. The harmony they created was imperfect, but sincere, and something shifted in the air between them. As evening approached, Kevin added more wood to the stove. He stood for a moment, watching the flames through the iron grate. "You'll stay," he said, not turning around. "Until you're strong again. Safe." It wasn't a question, but a vow. "Thank you," Elsbeth whispered, understanding all he meant by those simple words. The storm raged through the night and the next day, keeping them close to the fire's warmth. They shared quiet meals and quieter conversations, the isolation creating a strange intimacy neither had expected. On the evening of the second day, the wind finally died down. The clouds parted, revealing a vast field of stars through the cabin's small window. Elsbeth stood looking up at them, remembering nights in Pennsylvania when she'd questioned God's plan for her. But here, in this moment, she felt his presence more clearly than she had since fleeing her home. The stars sparkled like diamonds on black velvet, and peace settled over her heart like fresh snow. Kevin came to stand beside her at the window, his bulk casting a shadow in the starlight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The comfortable silence between them said enough. 3 days after the storm cleared, Kevin found a wrinkled invitation stuck to his door. The church ladies were hosting their monthly supper social. He nearly tossed it aside, as he had done dozens of times before, but something made him pause. "What's that?" Elsbeth asked, looking up from where she was kneading bread dough at the rough-hewn table. Kevin cleared his throat. "Church supper. Tonight in town." He hesitated, then added, "Reckon we could go if you're of a mind." Elsbeth's hands stilled in the dough. "Are you certain?" "I wouldn't want to cause trouble." Ain't causing trouble to break bread with folks, Kevin said firmly, though his own stomach knotted at the thought of returning to town so soon after their last visit. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the snow as they hitched up the sled. Elsbeth had changed into her best dress, plain black wool with a pristine white apron. She'd even rebraided her hair, tucking every strand neatly beneath her prayer cap. Kevin noticed she was trembling slightly as she climbed onto the sled bench. Without a word, he tucked an extra blanket around her shoulders. The gesture seemed to steady her. The ride to town was quiet, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the sled runners and the steady breathing of the horses. Pine Crossings Church sat on a small hill, its white steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. Light spilled from its windows, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted out into the cold evening air. Kevin helped Elsbeth down from the sled, noting how she squared her shoulders before walking toward the church hall. The rich smell of baked ham and simmering beans greeted them as they entered, along with the sweetness of fresh cornbread. The conversation didn't exactly stop when they walked in, but it shifted. Whispers followed in their wake as Kevin guided Elsbeth toward the food tables. He could feel the weight of dozens of stares, hear the hushed comments behind raised hands. Living together, unmarried? That poor man after losing Clara? Size of her, Lord have mercy. Elsbeth's cheeks flushed red, but she kept her chin up, though Kevin could see her hands shaking as she accepted a plate from the serving table. She was trying so hard to be brave, to weather the judgment with grace. They had almost made it through the serving line when Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, spoke loud enough for half the hall to hear. Well, I suppose some men aren't particular about their company, even if she does eat them out of house and home. Elsbeth froze. The plate in her hands wobbled dangerously, and Kevin saw tears gathering in her eyes. She turned toward the door, ready to flee, but Kevin's hand landed gently on her shoulder, holding her in place. Evening, folks, he said, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. Allow me to introduce Elsbeth Yoder, the woman who keeps me alive. His hand squeezed her shoulder softly. Her cooking reminds me of my mother's. Her stitching would put a seamstress to shame. And her hymns. He paused, looking down at Elsbeth with unexpected tenderness. Well, they brought music back to my cabin after 5 years of silence. Gasps rippled through the hall. Kevin Hale, the mountain hermit who'd barely spoken 10 words together since his wife's death, was not only at the church supper, but speaking openly of music and life returning to his home. Elsbeth stood straighter under his hand, her eyes shining with something more than tears now. For the first time since arriving in Pine Crossing, she felt truly seen, not as an oddity or a burden, but as someone of value. The tension in the room broke when little Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's daughter, tugged at Elsbeth's skirt. "Did you make any pie?" she asked hopefully. "Papa says Amish make the best pies." Elsbeth smiled, warm and genuine. "I didn't bring any tonight, but I know some stories about pie making, if you'd like to hear them while we eat." Sarah nodded eagerly, and several other children drifted closer, drawn by the promise of stories. Kevin watched as Elsbeth settled at a table, soon surrounded by young faces. Her voice carried softly as she told them about catching her brother stealing cooling pies from the windowsill, and how he'd had to explain to their mother why his beard was stained purple from the berries. The children's laughter seemed to ease something in the room. Other folks began to drift closer, drawn by the warmth of Elsbeth's gentle humor and the clear way she had with the young ones. Even Mrs. Patterson's pinched expression softened slightly when her own grandson crawled into Elsbeth's lap, asking for another story. Kevin found himself sharing a bench with Henry Red Elk, the half-Cheyenne trader who occasionally brought furs to his cabin. They ate in comfortable silence, both watching Elsbeth bloom under the children's attention. "She has a good heart," Henry said quietly, "like fresh snow, pure but stronger than people know." Kevin nodded, surprising himself by adding, "She's teaching me to see things different. Sometimes what looks like weakness is just waiting for the right kind of strength." The evening wore on, and while not everyone warmed to them, the worst of the judgment seemed to fade. When it came time to leave, several of the children extracted promises from Elsbeth to bring pie to the next supper. The miller's wife even pressed a recipe for peach preserves into her hand. The night air was crisp and clean as they loaded up the sled for the ride home. Stars sparkled overhead, and a quarter moon cast enough light to silver the snow. As they pulled away from the church, Elsbeth began to hum softly, not a hymn this time, but a simple, happy tune that seemed to match the gentle sway of the sled. Kevin glanced at her profile in the moonlight, noting how she sat taller now, more sure of herself. Something warm settled in his chest at the sight. He'd gotten used to silence in these past years, wrapped it around himself like armor. But now, listening to Elsbeth's quiet humming mix with the jingling harness bells, he realized just how cold that silence had been. The sled runners whispered through the snow, carrying them home through the starlit night. Neither felt the need to speak. The peaceful quiet between them said everything necessary. Elsbeth's melody drifted up toward the winter sky, a simple song of belonging finally found. A week passed like honey dripping from a spoon, sweet and slow. The morning air held the first hint of spring as Kevin and Elsbeth worked side by side, tending to the daily chores that kept their small homestead running. The routine they'd built felt as natural as breathing, until hoofbeats thundered up the snow-packed trail. Kevin straightened from splitting logs, his axe dropping to his side as 3 riders approached. Elsbeth paused in hanging laundry, a damp sheet clutched to her chest like a shield. The sun glinted off Mr. Markley's polished boots as he dismounted, 2 deputies flanking him. "Mr. Hale," Markley called out, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a snake oil salesman. He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag, withdrawing several official-looking papers. "I trust you're well this fine morning." Kevin said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he watched the railroad agent approach. Markley's fancy suit seemed out of place against the rough-hewn cabin and surrounding wilderness. "I have some matters to discuss with you," Markley continued, waving the papers. "Rather pressing matters, I'm afraid." "Say your piece," Kevin growled, planting his feet. Markley's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It seems there's been an oversight regarding your water rights. Our records show they were never properly filed with the Territory Office." "That's nonsense," Kevin cut in. "My father filed those papers 20 years ago. Then you'll have no trouble producing proof of filing." Markley's smile widened. "Because without it, this land and its water rights revert to territorial control. The railroad has already submitted a claim for a new depot site." The deputies shifted uneasily in their saddles as Kevin took a menacing step forward. "This is my land, my water. Been in my family since before you were measuring miles for your iron horse." "The law is the law, Mr. Hale." Markley held out one of the papers. "You have 2 weeks to produce proof of filing. Otherwise, we'll begin construction of the depot come first thaw." Kevin snatched the paper, his massive hands crumpling the edges. "And if I refuse? Then these good deputies will be forced to remove you." Markley glanced at Elsbeth, still frozen by the laundry line. "All occupants of this property." From her position, Elsbeth could see the muscles in Kevin's neck straining like rope pulled taut. His voice, when it came, was dangerous and low. "Get off my land." Markley tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. 2 weeks, Mr. Hale. I suggest you use them wisely." He mounted his horse and wheeled around, the deputies following close behind. Kevin stood rigid until the riders disappeared around the bend. Then he began to pace, reading the paper with growing fury. Elsbeth quietly finished hanging the laundry and slipped inside the cabin, climbing the ladder to the loft where she often retreated to pray or think. Through the floorboards, she could hear Kevin's heavy footsteps below, punctuated by occasional muttered curses. The afternoon stretched long and tense. She busied herself mending one of his shirts, her stitches neat and small, a practice that usually calmed her mind. But today, her hands trembled. As dusk settled over the mountains, Kevin's voice drifted up through the gaps in the planks. He was talking to himself, his words bitter with frustration. Maybe I should have let her keep walking that night. Now she'll be caught up in this mess, too. Ain't right, dragging her into my troubles. Elsbeth's needle stopped mid-stitch. The words struck her heart like arrows of ice. She pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Pulling her quilt around her shoulders, she curled onto her thin mattress and prayed silently, tears soaking her pillow. Sleep came in fits and starts. When dawn painted the cabin walls pink, Elsbeth rose and dressed quietly. She descended the ladder to find Kevin already at the table, a cup of coffee cooling before him. Their usual morning greeting died in the heavy silence. She moved through her breakfast routine mechanically, stoking the stove, mixing biscuit dough, frying salt pork. When she set his plate before him, their eyes didn't meet. The only sounds were the scrape of forks and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Kevin cleared his throat once, as if to speak, but nothing followed. Elsbeth gathered the dishes, her movements careful and contained. Each clank of pottery seemed too loud in the strained quiet. Outside, the day demanded attention despite their troubles. They worked together as always, though the easy rhythm they'd developed was broken. Kevin attacked the woodpile with fierce swings, while Elsbeth struggled with larger logs than usual, too proud to ask for help. The afternoon sun cast long shadows when Elsbeth finally returned to the cabin to prepare supper. Her hands were raw from the rough wood, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. As she kneaded bread dough on the table, tears began sliding down her cheeks unbidden. She tried to wipe them away quickly with her flour-covered apron, but Kevin chose that moment to enter for more coffee. He stopped in the doorway, watching her failed attempt to hide her distress. The silence between them stretched tight as a fiddle string. "Elsbeth," he began, his voice rougher than usual. She kept her eyes on the dough, pressing and folding with shaking hands. "The bread will be ready soon," she said softly, her voice betraying her despite her best efforts to sound normal. Kevin took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure of his welcome. Another tear escaped down Elsbeth's cheek, leaving a trail in the flour dust. Her fingers worked the dough with increasing desperation, as if she could knead away the pain of his words from the night before. The cabin grew darker as the sun settled behind the mountains. Neither spoke as Elsbeth shaped the bread and slid it into the oven. The familiar scent of baking bread filled the air, but tonight it brought no comfort. She could feel Kevin's presence behind her, solid as the mountain itself, but somehow more distant than ever before. Outside, a lone coyote called into the gathering dusk. Inside, the silence lay heavy as fresh fallen snow between two people who had begun to hope they'd found something worth keeping. The days following Markley's visit stretched like shadows at dusk. Morning light crept through the cabin windows, finding Elsbeth already at work, her movements careful and contained. She went about her tasks with quiet efficiency, but the warmth that had begun to fill their shared space had frozen over like the creek outside. Kevin noticed how she turned away whenever their eyes might meet, how her usual gentle humming had fallen silent. The walls seemed to close in around them, heavy with unspoken words. At breakfast, the scrape of spoons against bowls echoed too loudly in the stillness. On the third morning, Elsbeth wrapped herself in her thick shawl and headed out to gather eggs from the chicken coop. Kevin watched through the window as she picked her way across the yard, her breath clouding in the bitter air. The ground was treacherous with ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. His heart leaped into his throat as her feet suddenly shot out from under her. Without thinking, he burst through the door, crossing the distance in long strides. His hands reached for her shoulders to steady her, but she twisted away, catching herself against the coop's rough wall. "I can manage," she said, her voice tight. The words hung between them like frost. Kevin's hands fell to his sides, useless. "The ice is dangerous." "I know about ice, Kevin Hale." Her tone held an edge he'd never heard before. She disappeared into the coop, leaving him standing in the cold. Inside the dim shelter, Elsbeth pressed her forehead against the splintered wood. Her heart hammered not from the near fall, but from the touch she'd refused. His hands had felt so sure, so ready to catch her. But his words from days ago still stung. Maybe he should have let her keep walking that night. She gathered the eggs with trembling fingers, tucking them carefully in her apron. The day dragged on, marked by the sun's slow arc across the window panes. Kevin tried to focus on searching through his stored papers, but his eyes kept straying to Elsbeth as she moved about the cabin. She'd grown so familiar in their small space, the way she tested the stove's heat with her palm, how she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear while working. Now she seemed like a stranger again, wrapped in silence like a cloak. Supper was beans and cornbread, the same meal they'd shared dozens of times before. But tonight, the food might as well have been ashes for all its taste. Elsbeth kept her eyes on her plate, eating small, careful bites. Kevin pushed his beans around, words building in his throat that he didn't know how to voice. The fire had burned low when Kevin finally spoke. "I reckon I'll have to ride to the county office tomorrow." His voice sounded rough from disuse. "Maybe they'll have records of the water rights there." Elsbeth's hands stilled in her mending. "How long will you be gone?" 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the weather." She nodded, her needle resuming its steady path through the fabric. "I'll stay and tend things here." "You don't have to," he began. "I can manage," she repeated those same words from morning, but softer now, tired. Kevin wanted to argue, to insist she come with him, but pride and uncertainty held his tongue. Instead, he reached for Clara's old Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He ran his fingers over the familiar texture, remembering how his wife used to read by lamplight, her voice gentle in the evening quiet. From the loft above came the sound of singing, so faint he almost missed it. Elsbeth's voice carried the same hymn she'd sung that first morning when hope had seemed possible. But now the words held a different weight, heavy with something like mourning. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The melody drifted down like falling snow, each note a reminder of what was slipping away. Kevin sat motionless, the Bible cold in his hands, listening as Elsbeth's voice wove through the shadows. The fire crackled and settled, throwing sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called once, lonely in the darkness. Morning arrived clear and bitter cold. Kevin prepared for his journey while Elsbeth packed him food for the trail. Bread, dried meat, the last of the winter apples. They moved around each other like wary dancers, careful not to touch. "There's enough wood split for 3 days," Kevin said, checking his saddlebags. "More in the lean-to if you need it." "I know." Elsbeth stood by the stove, her hands clasped before her. "The rifle's loaded, up on the pegs, just in case." "I know how to shoot," she interrupted quietly. At his surprised look, she added, "My brothers taught me before—" She let the sentence trail off, looking away. Kevin nodded, adjusting his coat. There was more he wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. He'd never been good at mending things that weren't made of wood or leather. Outside, his horse stamped impatiently, breath streaming in the cold air. Kevin mounted up, settling into the creaking saddle. Snow had begun to fall again, lazy flakes that danced in the morning light. He turned his horse toward the trail, then paused, looking back at the cabin. Light glowed in the window, and through the glass he could see Elsbeth standing at the stove. Something in her solitary figure made his chest ache. She looked so small against the vast white wilderness, yet somehow stronger than he'd first thought. The horse shifted beneath him, eager to move. Kevin touched his heels to its flanks, but his troubled thoughts remained with the woman he was leaving behind. As he rode into the falling snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that more than just water rights hung in the balance of the next few days. Behind him, smoke rose straight and true from the cabin's chimney, a thin gray line against the endless white sky. The last thing he saw before the trees swallowed him was Elsbeth's face at the window, watching him go, her expression hidden by the reflected glare of snow. The worn trail to the county seat stretched before Kevin like a ribbon of muddy snow through the pines. His horse's hooves made wet sucking sounds in the half-frozen ground as they picked their way down from the highlands. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, but brought little warmth to chase away the bone-deep chill. Kevin's thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin, to Elsbeth's hurt silence. He'd faced many hard rides in his years in the mountains, but none had felt as heavy as this one. Each mile seemed to add another weight to his shoulders. By late afternoon, his horse was starting to tire. The falling temperature warned of another bitter night ahead. Through breaks in the trees, Kevin could see the smoke from chimneys rising from the small town of Miller's Fork. It wasn't much, a dozen buildings strung along a rutted main street, but it would have to do for the night. The Widow Parker's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a weathered two-story building with yellow lamplight glowing in its windows. The widow herself answered his knock, a thin woman with sharp eyes and grayer hair than Kevin remembered from his last visit. "Well, if it ain't Kevin Hale," she said, looking him up and down. "Ain't seen you down from that mountain in an age." "Ma'am," Kevin removed his hat. "Got business at the county seat. Need a bed for the night if you've got one." She nodded, stepping back to let him in. Second door on the left upstairs. Supper's at 6 sharp. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a crocheted blanket that smelled of lavender. Kevin sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, his muscles aching from the ride. From somewhere below came the clatter of dishes and the smell of cooking. Supper was beans and salt pork, served at a long table with 3 other boarders, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple. Kevin ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. His mind was on tomorrow's task, and on Elsbeth alone in his cabin, probably still hurt by his thoughtless words. Sleep came in fits and starts that night, broken by the creak of the old house settling and the whistle of wind through ill-fitting windows. Kevin dreamed of avalanches and lost papers, of Clara's Bible falling into bottomless snow. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Kevin rode the final miles to the county seat, a larger town with actual brick buildings and a proper courthouse. The county clerk's office was on the ground floor, a cramped space that smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk himself was a weaselly little man with ink-stained fingers and nervous eyes. He barely looked up when Kevin entered, though the floor creaked loudly under the mountain man's weight. "Need to see the water rights records for my homestead," Kevin said, laying his hat on the counter. "Up Cedar Creek way." The clerk shuffled some papers. "Cedar Creek, you say? That's—" He made a show of checking different stacks. "Seems we're having trouble locating those particular files." Kevin's jaw tightened. "Those papers were filed proper, 15 years ago. My wife herself rode down to do it." "Well, yes, I'm sure they were, but—" The clerk glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "There's been some reorganizing lately. Lots of old files got moved. Or lost." "Lost." Kevin's fist came down hard on the counter, making the inkwell jump. "Ain't nothing lost. Railroad's been here, ain't they?" The clerk flinched, but before he could answer, a familiar voice came from the doorway. "Problem here?" Sheriff Pike stood there, thumbs hooked in his belt. His badge caught the weak light from the windows. "No problem," Kevin growled. "Just trying to get at my rightful papers." "Now, Kevin," the sheriff said, his voice careful and measured. "You know how these things work. Files get misplaced. Might take weeks to sort through everything. Weeks I ain't got, and you know it. Then I suggest you calm down and figure out another way." The sheriff's hand wasn't on his gun, but the meaning was clear enough. "Don't want any trouble in my town." Kevin stared hard at both men, his hands clenching and unclenching. Finally, he snatched his hat off the counter. "Much obliged for your time," he said, the words bitter as medicine. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Kevin stood on the courthouse steps, feeling more lost than he had in years. The railroad's reach was longer than he'd imagined, corrupting even this dusty office with its money and influence. That night, in another rented room, Kevin sat on the edge of his bed and did something he hadn't done since Clara died. He prayed. The words came rough and halting at first, like water breaking through ice. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't been much for talking to you lately. Reckon I've been carrying too much anger. But I need help now, not just for me, but for Elsbeth too. She trusted me to protect her, and I'm failing at that just like I failed Clara." The only answer was the wind rattling the window glass. Kevin bowed his head lower, his big hands clasped tight. "Show me the way through this. Please." Meanwhile, back in the mountain cabin, Elsbeth struggled with her own trials. The emptiness of the cabin seemed to echo with every movement. She tried to keep to their normal routine, feeding the chickens, hauling water, keeping the fire stoked. But everything felt harder without Kevin's steady presence. That afternoon, she decided to bake bread, hoping the familiar task would settle her spirit. She mixed the ingredients just as her mother had taught her: flour, yeast, a pinch of salt. Her hands worked the dough with practiced movements while she hummed a hymn to keep time. But her mind wandered to Kevin, wondering if he was safe, if he'd found the papers they needed. The dough ended up under-kneaded, the oven too hot. When she pulled out the loaf, it was black on top and raw in the middle. Elsbeth stared at the ruined bread, her vision blurring with tears. It was such a simple thing, something she'd done 1,000 times before. The failure felt like confirmation of everything her father had said about her. Useless, worthless, unable to do even basic tasks right. She sank to her knees beside the stove, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. "Lord," she whispered in Pennsylvania Dutch, "I am not strong enough for this." But even as the words left her mouth, something stirred in her heart. Almost without conscious thought, she began to sing, not a whisper this time, but full-voiced, letting the old hymn fill the cabin. "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee." The familiar words seemed to gather strength as they rose, pushing back the shadows of doubt. Elsbeth felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking up in spring. She remembered how far she'd already come, how many obstacles she'd already overcome. Strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. The truth of the words filled her heart. She wasn't alone. She never had been. God had brought her this far. He wouldn't abandon her now. Wiping her eyes, Elsbeth stood up. She scraped out the burnt bread and began again, measuring the flour with steady hands. This time she sang as she worked, her voice growing stronger with each verse. As evening settled over the mountains, Kevin began his journey home. His horse plodded through fresh snow, head low against the wind. Every step seemed to echo with defeat. The county seat fell away behind him, taking with it his last hope of fighting the railroad through legal means. He thought of Elsbeth waiting at the cabin, probably watching the trail for his return. How could he face her with this failure? How could he protect her when he couldn't even protect his own land? The questions weighted his shoulders as heavily as the gathering storm clouds above. Night was falling fast, and the temperature with it. Kevin urged his tired horse toward the next town, knowing they'd need shelter soon. But even in his weariness, Something had shifted during that long night of prayer. The anger that had driven him for so long felt different now, less bitter, more focused. Maybe God hadn't answered him directly, but the simple act of asking for help had changed something inside him. The snow began to fall again as Kevin searched for lodging, each flake carrying its own small burden of doubt. Yet somewhere ahead, through the gathering darkness, lay home. And with it, perhaps, answers he hadn't yet thought to seek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard as Elsbeth peered out the cabin window. Kevin should return today, but the thought brought little comfort. His words about regretting her presence still stung like frost on bare skin. The cabin walls seemed to close in around her, echoing with silence. In the barn, Kevin's old mule dozed in his stall, ears twitching at her approach. Elsbeth's hands trembled as she lifted the heavy harness from its peg. The leather creaked as she worked, fitting straps and buckles with clumsy fingers. Her father's voice rang in her memory. "Useless girl, can't even harness proper." But the mule stood patient as she fumbled, and soon the wagon stood ready. Elsbeth gathered supplies, blankets, some bread, a water jug. Her heart pounded as she climbed onto the wagon seat. The colony lay 2 days east, if she remembered right. Maybe there, among her own people, she could find help for Kevin's trouble. Maybe they would see she had changed, grown stronger. "Please forgive me," she whispered to the empty cabin before clucking to the mule. The wagon wheels cut fresh tracks in the snow as they set out. Wind whipped at her heavy skirts, and Elsbeth pulled her shawl tighter. The morning light caught ice crystals in the air, making them sparkle like diamond dust. She began to sing softly, the hymns of her childhood rising unbidden to her lips. That night, she made camp beneath a stand of pine trees, the wagon providing some shelter from the wind. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by coyote calls and the cracking of frozen branches. By dawn, her muscles ached from the cold, but she pressed on. The Amish settlement appeared near sunset the second day, familiar buildings rising from the winter-white fields like dark ships on a pale sea. Smoke rose from chimneys, and lamplight glowed in windows. Elsbeth's hands shook as she guided the mule down the main road. People emerged from houses and shops, staring. Women in plain dresses whispered behind raised hands. Children pointed until their mothers hushed them. Elsbeth kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned with shame. Outside the meeting house, several elders gathered. Their stern faces showed no welcome, only judgment. Elder Stoltzfus, his beard gray as winter sky, stepped forward. "So, the disobedient one returns." Elsbeth climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. "I come seeking help. The man who took me in, his land is threatened by the railroad. I thought perhaps—" "Silence!" Her father's voice cut through the crowd as he pushed forward. His face was red with anger. "You dare return here after bringing shame to our family?" Elsbeth flinched but stood her ground. "Father, please, I only ask for—" "Ask? You lost the right to ask anything when you ran away like a wild thing." He turned to the gathered crowd. "Look at her, fat as ever, living in sin with some English mountain man. No proper husband would have her then. None will have her now." The words struck like physical blows. Elsbeth felt her knees give way, and she sank into the snow. Above her, faces blurred through her tears. Faces she had known all her life, now turned cold as stone. "Please," she whispered, then louder, "please listen." "God led me to a good man's door. He showed kindness when I had none. Now he needs help, and I hoped." "Thought? Hoped?" her father sneered. "You never had sense enough for either. The English has addled what little mind you had." He spat in the snow beside her. "You're cursed, girl, cursed by your own willfulness." Elder Stoltzfus raised his hand. "This is God's judgment on your pride, Elsbeth Yoder. You chose to leave his people. Now you must bear the consequences." "The English can have you," another elder added. "We want no part of your shame." Elsbeth began to pray aloud, her voice carrying in the winter air. "Lord, show them your mercy. Show them your love can bridge any distance." "Enough!" Her father's boot scattered snow across her skirts. "Get out! You're no daughter of mine!" The crowd began to disperse, turning their backs one by one. Women herded children inside, pulling curtains closed against the sight of her. Elsbeth remained kneeling in the snow until darkness fell, and the last lamp was extinguished. Only then did she climb back into the wagon, leading the mule to the edge of town. In a small grove of bare trees, she made camp, unable to face the long ride home in darkness. The night sky spread above her like black velvet scattered with diamond chips, cold and distant as her people's hearts. Wrapped in blankets in the wagon bed, Elsbeth wept until no more tears would come. The sound of her sobs carried across the snow-covered fields, heard only by the winter wind and the watching stars. Miles away, Kevin urged his tired horse faster along the trail home. Something felt wrong, like a storm gathering, though the sky was clear. The sense of urgency pressed at him, making his spine tingle with unease. "Faster, boy," he murmured to his mount. "Something ain't right." The horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm on the frozen ground as they pressed homeward through the gathering dark. Kevin's prayer was wordless now, just a constant pleading in his heart. "Lord, let her be safe. Let me not be too late." Above them both, Kevin on the trail, Elsbeth in her lonely wagon, the same stars wheeled in their ancient paths, bearing silent witness to human pain and pride, to rejection and regret, to the long road home that lay ahead for both of them. Kevin's horse stumbled through fresh snow as they crested the final ridge before his cabin. His heart seized at the sight below. No smoke rose from the chimney, no warm light glowed in the windows. The cabin stood dark and silent against the white landscape. "No," he whispered, spurring his mount forward. The beast's hooves punched through crusty snow as they thundered down the slope. Kevin's hands were numb on the reins, his face raw from 3 days of hard riding. But physical discomfort meant nothing compared to the fear gripping his chest. He practically fell from the saddle at his cabin door, boots hitting the packed earth with a thud. "Elsbeth?" His voice echoed off the surrounding pines. No answer came. The door swung open at his touch. Inside, the hearth was cold, ashes scattered as if the fire had died days ago. Kevin's eyes swept the empty main room, then up to the loft. Her shawl was missing from its peg. The bread paddle still wore traces of flour, but the dough bowl sat empty. Lord above, no. His legs nearly gave out as he stumbled back outside. That's when he saw them. Wagon tracks leading away from the barn, already softened by fresh snow but still visible. His old mule and wagon were gone. Kevin's hands shook as he checked his horse. The beast was spent from the hard ride home, flanks heaving with exhaustion. But there was no choice. He had to follow those tracks before they vanished completely. "Just a little more, old friend," he murmured, swinging back into the saddle. He grabbed only his heavy coat and rifle before spurring the horse after the wagon trail. The sun was already sliding toward afternoon, painting long shadows across the snow. Each hour of daylight lost was another hour Elsbeth spent alone in the bitter cold. As he rode, Kevin's mind tortured him with possibilities. Had his careless words about regretting her arrival driven her to this? He remembered her silence in those last days before he left, the hurt in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. What a fool he'd been, letting pride and fear keep him from speaking what was in his heart. "Please, Lord," he prayed aloud, his first real prayer in years. "Don't let me lose her too, not like Clara. I can't bear it again." The wind whipped his words away, but he kept praying, kept pushing his horse through deepening snow. The tracks led east, toward the Amish colony. Kevin's heart sank as he realized where she must have gone. Those people who had scorned her, treated her like unwanted cattle, She had returned to them seeking help. The thought of her facing their judgment alone made him dig his heels harder into his horse's flanks. Miles away, Elsbeth stirred in the wagon bed, her body stiff with cold. The blankets had grown damp with snow during the night, offering little warmth now. Her fingers felt like wooden sticks, her feet beyond feeling. Even her tears seemed to freeze before they could fall. "Perhaps this is fitting," she whispered to the gray morning sky. "To die alone, unwanted, as Father said I would." The words formed clouds in the frigid air. She had failed in her mission to help Kevin, failed to find acceptance among her own people, failed at everything except proving her father right. She tried to move, to sit up, but her limbs refused to respond properly. The cold had seeped into her bones, making every movement an agony. Above her, heavy clouds promised more snow. Elsbeth closed her eyes, thinking of Kevin's cabin, of the warmth of his rare smiles, of the gentle way he had bandaged her hands that first morning. "I'm sorry," she breathed, though he wasn't there to hear it. Sorry for running away, for not being strong enough, for daring to hope she could be more than what everyone said she was. The day grew darker as clouds thickened overhead. Elsbeth drifted in and out of awareness, her thoughts growing sluggish. She thought she heard hoofbeats sometimes, but knew it must be her mind playing tricks. Who would come looking for her? She was nothing, nobody, just a burden better cast aside. "Elsbeth!" The voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dear God, Elsbeth!" Suddenly rough hands were touching her face, pulling away the frozen blankets. She forced her eyes open to find Kevin's face hovering above her, his expression wild with fear. Was this another dream? "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice breaking. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against his broad chest. Something warm and heavy settled around her. His coat, she realized dimly. He was wrapping her in his own coat, holding her close like she was precious cargo. "Kevin," she managed through chattering teeth. "Why did you—" "Hush now," he said fiercely, carrying her to the front of the wagon. He settled them both onto the seat, keeping her pressed against him as he gathered the reins. "Just stay awake. Stay with me." The mule plodded forward as snow began to fall in thick flakes. Kevin kept one arm tight around Elsbeth, his body heat slowly seeping into her frozen limbs. Pain bloomed as feeling returned to her fingers and toes, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was alive. "I don't need a son," Kevin said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "I never needed that. I need you, Elsbeth. Just you alive and well and singing your hymns in my cabin. When I saw those tracks leading away—" He broke off, pulling her closer. Elsbeth began to sob then, great racking cries that shook her whole body. All the fear and shame and loneliness poured out of her as Kevin held her steady. Snow fell around them in the gathering dusk, but she barely noticed. His words echoed in her mind. "I need you. Just you." "I thought," she hiccuped between sobs, "I thought you regretted letting me stay, that I was just another burden." "No," Kevin's arm tightened around her. "Never that. I regret my foolish pride, my harsh words. But having you in my home has been—" He struggled for words. "Like sunrise after the longest night. You brought light back to that dark cabin, Elsbeth. Brought music and warmth and hope when I thought I'd lost all three forever." The mule plodded steadily onward as snow continued to fall. Elsbeth's tears gradually slowed, though she kept her face pressed against Kevin's chest. His heartbeat was strong and steady under her ear, the most comforting sound she'd ever heard. "My father said no man would want me," she whispered. "Said I was cursed, unwanted." "Your father was wrong," Kevin's voice rumbled in his chest. "So wrong. You are wanted, Elsbeth. You are needed. Here, with me, if you'll stay." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these were different. Tears of relief, of joy, of belonging at last. Kevin's arm never left her shoulders as he guided the wagon through deepening snow, heading home through the gathering night. The stars were hidden behind snow clouds, but Elsbeth didn't need to see them to feel God's presence now. It was there in Kevin's steady embrace, in the warmth of his coat around her shoulders, in the quiet certainty of his words, "You are wanted, you are needed. Here, with me." Snow fell silently around them as the wagon carried them home, back to the cabin where light and warmth and hope waited. Back to where they belonged, together. Dawn painted the Colorado highlands in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Kevin guided his wagon up the snow-covered trail to the cabin. Beside him, Elsbeth dozed fitfully, still wrapped in blankets and his great coat. The night's journey had taken its toll on them both, but worry gnawed at Kevin's heart. He knew the railroad's deadline loomed close. Once inside, he lifted Elsbeth from the wagon as carefully as if she were made of spun glass. She stirred against his chest, murmuring a protest that she could walk, but he wouldn't hear of it. "You need rest," he said firmly, carrying her through the cabin door. The interior was cold and dark. Kevin laid Elsbeth on her bed in the loft, adding extra quilts before hurrying to build up the fire. Soon, warmth began to seep back into the cabin's bones. He brewed strong coffee and made a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of their molasses. "I must ride out again," he told her, as she sipped carefully from a steaming cup. "There's someone who might help us with the water claim." Elsbeth's eyes widened with concern. "Who?" "Henry Red Elk. He's a Ute neighbor who was there the day I filed my claim, years back. If anyone can verify the truth, it's him." Kevin checked on his horse, which had rested through what remained of the night. The beast seemed recovered enough for another journey. He saddled up quickly, his mind already planning the route to Henry's winter camp. "I'll return as soon as I can," he promised Elsbeth. "Stay warm and rest." The morning air was crisp and clean as Kevin rode east, following a trail he knew by heart. Henry Red Elk's camp lay tucked into a protected valley where the winter winds couldn't reach so fierce. Smoke from several lodges rose straight and true against the pale sky. Henry was already outside when Kevin approached, watching his arrival with careful eyes. The Ute man stood straight and dignified despite the cold, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples. "Kevin Hale," Henry greeted him with a slight nod. "It has been many moons." "Too many, friend." Kevin dismounted, showing proper respect by waiting to be invited closer. "I've come to ask for your help." Henry gestured for Kevin to join him by his lodge's fire. "Speak your need." Kevin explained about the railroad's claim, about Markley's threats, and about the supposedly missing paperwork. "You were there that day, Henry. You saw me file the water rights with your own eyes." Henry's expression remained thoughtful as he stared into the flames. "I remember," he said finally. "The clerk with the red beard stamped your paper. He used green ink." Kevin's heart leaped. Such a specific detail could help prove the truth. "Would you testify to this, before the judge?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. Kevin knew what he was asking. For a native man to enter the white man's courthouse was no small thing, especially given the history of broken promises and stolen lands. "You have always dealt honestly with my people," Henry said at last, "never moving your fences in the night like others, never poisoning the water upstream." He met Kevin's eyes. "I will speak what I saw." Relief flooded through Kevin. "Thank you, friend. We must ride to the county seat today. The deadline is tomorrow." "I will ready my horse," Henry said, rising smoothly. When Kevin returned to the cabin, he found Elsbeth dressed and waiting, her face set with determination. "I'm coming with you," she announced before he could speak. "You're not strong enough yet," he protested. "The ride is long and cold." "I am stronger than I look," she said firmly, "and we face this together now." Kevin knew that set to her jaw. He'd seen it before when she insisted on doing her share of chores despite bleeding hands. There would be no arguing with her now. They set out within the hour, Elsbeth bundled warmly in the wagon while Kevin rode alongside. Henry joined them on the trail, his paint horse sure-footed in the snow. The three made steady progress toward the county seat, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and share a cold meal. The courthouse loomed before them as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Markley stood on the steps with two deputies, his smile turning to a scowl when he saw Henry Red Elk among their party. "What's this?" he demanded as they approached. "Some kind of savage circus?" "Mind your tongue," Kevin growled, helping Elsbeth down from the wagon. Henry said nothing, but his dignity spoke volumes. Inside the courthouse, the judge was preparing to leave for the day. "Your Honor," Kevin called, "we've come about the water rights dispute." The elderly judge peered at them over his spectacles. "Cutting it mighty close, Mr. Hale. Tomorrow's your deadline." "I've brought a witness, Your Honor. Someone who saw me file the claim 5 years ago." The judge settled back in his chair with a sigh. "Very well. Let's hear it." Henry stepped forward, his bearing proud despite the hostile stares from Markley and his men. "I am Henry Red Elk. I trade furs and horses with settlers when they deal fair. 5 years ago, I stood in this building and watched Kevin Hale file his water claim." "And why should we trust the word of a—" Markley began, but the judge cut him off. "Let him speak." Henry continued, his voice clear and steady. The clerk had a red beard. He used green ink to stamp the paper. It was the day after the first snow of winter. Kevin reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "I kept a copy of a letter the clerk sent me later that month, confirming the filing." He handed it to the judge. "Look at the ink color on the stamp, Your Honor." The judge examined the document carefully, then looked at the current clerk. "Bring me the record of stamps used in that period." The clerk shuffled through a dusty ledger, his face growing pale. "Your Honor, it shows we did use green ink that month. We switched to blue in December." Markley's face turned an ugly shade of red. "This proves nothing. A coincidence at best, a conspiracy at worst." "It proves," the judge said firmly, "that Mr. Hale's claim was indeed filed and recorded. The fact that the official copy has conveniently disappeared from our records is far more suspicious than this evidence and testimony." He straightened in his chair. "I find in favor of Mr. Hale. His water rights stand as originally claimed." Elsbeth's hand found Kevin's and squeezed tight. He could feel her trembling with relief beside him. Markley stormed forward, jabbing a finger at Kevin's chest. "This isn't over, Hale. The railroad always gets what it wants." "Not today it doesn't," the judge said coldly. "And if any harm comes to Mr. Hale's property or his witnesses, we'll know where to look first. Good day, Mr. Markley." The railroad agent stormed out, his boots echoing angrily down the courthouse hall. Kevin turned to Henry, extending his hand. "Thank you, friend. I'm in your debt." Henry clasped his hand briefly. No debt between neighbors who honor truth. With a slight nod to Elsbeth, he turned and left as quietly as he had come. In the empty courthouse, Kevin drew Elsbeth close. "Thank you for insisting on coming," he whispered, "for standing beside me." "Where else would I be?" she asked softly. Kevin lifted his face to the courthouse ceiling, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Lord, for showing us the way." Elsbeth's quiet "Amen" echoed his gratitude as they stood together, their joined hands a bridge between past and future, between grief and hope, between loneliness and love. The journey back to the cabin was quiet but peaceful, their victory settling around them like a warm blanket against the winter chill. Kevin drove the wagon while Elsbeth huddled beside him, both lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. As they crested the final ridge, smoke from their chimney greeted them. Henry Red Elk's wife had kindly tended the fire in their absence. The sight of those gray wisps curling against the pale sky made Elsbeth's heart flutter. This was home now. Truly home. The changes began subtly at first. 2 days after their return, Martha Jensen from the general store appeared at their door with a basket of fresh biscuits and preserves. "Heard tell you stood up to that railroad man," she said simply, pressing the basket into Elsbeth's hands. "Reckon that took some spine." Before Elsbeth could properly thank her, Martha had turned and trudged back through the snow, leaving only boot prints and kindness behind. The next morning, they woke to find a stack of split firewood by the door. Kevin recognized the axe work, Tom Wheeler from the sawmill. No note, no fanfare, just the silent acknowledgement of neighbors helping neighbors. As the days passed, more gifts appeared. A jar of honey, a sack of cornmeal, even a warm quilt left carefully folded on their porch. Each offering carried the same message. The community had chosen its side. Inside the cabin, Elsbeth worked to put down roots of her own. She had noticed an empty wooden crate catching dust in the corner, and an idea took hold. One morning, while Kevin was out checking his trap lines, she scrubbed the box clean and lined it with the last of her old apron, cut into strips. "What's this about?" Kevin asked when he returned, watching her fill the cloth-lined box with rich soil from beneath the melted snow near the spring. "Winter greens?" she explained, showing him the handful of seeds she'd traded her hair ribbon for at the general store. "If we keep it near the window, they'll grow even now. Not much, but enough for some fresh taste in our stews." Kevin studied her face, noting the hope in her eyes. This wasn't just about greens. This was about tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that. This was about staying. He disappeared into his workshop that afternoon, the sound of his saw and hammer ringing through the cold air. Elsbeth didn't pry, but she noticed him carrying in fresh pine boards, planing them smooth in the evenings by lamplight. A week later, while she was kneading bread, Kevin cleared his throat. "Got something to show you?" he said gruffly. There in the corner by the fire stood a chair, not the rough stools they'd been using, but a proper chair with a wide seat and a gently curved back. The wood glowed golden in the firelight. Each joint fitted perfect and true. "It's sized for you," Kevin said quietly. "Proper comfortable, I hope." Elsbeth's hands trembled as she touched the smooth armrest. She knew what this meant. This wasn't a temporary seat, but a permanent place. Her place. "Thank you," she whispered, sinking into its embrace. The seat cradled her generously, neither too snug nor too loose. Kevin had built it for her exactly as she was, no judgment, no expectations of change. That evening, as snow fell soft outside, they shared a simple supper of bean soup and fresh bread. The new chair creaked companionably as Elsbeth rocked slightly, contentment warming her more than the fire. "I never properly thanked you," Kevin said suddenly, setting down his spoon. "For what?" "Your courage. Coming with me to face Markley. Standing beside me in that courthouse." He looked down at his bowl. "Most folks would have hidden away, let me face it alone, but you didn't." Elsbeth's cheeks flushed pink in the firelight. "I couldn't let you stand alone. Not when—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express what had grown between them. "Not when we're family," Kevin finished softly. The word hung in the air between them, delicate as a soap bubble, precious as gold. Family, not by blood or law, but by choice and trust, and shared burdens carried together. After the dishes were cleared, Kevin remained by the fire, staring at something in his hands. Elsbeth recognized the worn leather binding, Clara's Bible, untouched since that terrible day 5 winters past. With trembling fingers, Kevin opened it. Dust motes danced in the firelight as he turned to the Book of Ruth. His voice was rough at first, unused to reading aloud, but it steadied as the familiar words filled the cabin. "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Elsbeth moved quietly from her chair to kneel beside him, her hand coming to rest gently on his arm. Together they read on, their voices joining in the ancient promises of faith and family. The fire crackled softly, and outside an owl called once, long and low. In that moment, the cabin seemed to shift around them, its rough-hewn walls expanding to hold something larger than mere shelter. Every object glowed with new meaning, her wintergreens reaching toward the window light, his carefully crafted chair holding her close, Clara's Bible open between them, binding past to present with threads of grace. This was more than survival now. This was home. This was hope. This was the beginning of healing for them both. The evening deepened into night, but neither moved to leave the fireside. They sat together, reading on through Psalms and Proverbs, their shadows merged on the cabin wall behind them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a whispered blessing on this place where two wounded souls had found, at last, the courage to begin again. Elsbeth's seed box caught the last gleam of firelight, promising green life even in the depths of winter. Kevin's chair stood ready to hold her through all the seasons to come. And between them, the open Bible spoke of love that endured beyond death, of mercy made new each morning, of the mysterious ways God worked to bring beauty from ashes and joy from mourning. They were no longer mere survivors sharing space, but a family building something precious together, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, day by patient day. The cabin had become a sanctuary, not just from the cold, but for their hearts' slow healing. The fire settled lower, casting soft shadows on the walls. Neither spoke much now, but the silence between them was rich with understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they would face them together, in this place they now truly called home. The late February sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted yard as Elsbeth gathered eggs from the henhouse. Her movements were slower than usual, each bend and reach taking more effort than it should. She had noticed this creeping fatigue over the past few days, a heaviness in her limbs, a tendency to need rest even after simple tasks. Inside the cabin, she placed the eggs carefully in their wooden bowl, steadying herself against the rough-hewn table as a wave of dizziness passed over her. The sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant, just strange and new, like her body was harboring a secret. Kevin noticed her pause. He set down the harness he was mending and crossed the room in 2 long strides. "You all right?" "I am," she said softly, then hesitated. The thought that had been growing in her mind these past days pressed forward, demanding voice. "Though I've been wondering." She trailed off, suddenly shy despite all they'd shared. Kevin waited patiently, his presence steady and encouraging. "I've been so tired lately," she continued, her cheeks warming, "and peculiar feeling like my body's not quite my own." She lifted her eyes to his, hardly daring to hope. "I wonder if perhaps I might be with child." The words hung in the air between them, delicate as frost crystals. Kevin's expression softened, and he reached out to cup her face in his weathered hands. His touch was gentle, reverent almost. "Whether or not the Lord blesses us with little ones," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you're my answered prayer, Elsbeth. The family I never thought to have again." Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned into his touch. How far she'd come from that desperate night when she'd pounded on his door, offering herself as nothing more than a means to an end. Now, here she stood, cherished for herself alone. "There's wood needs hauling," Kevin said after a moment, his hands still framing her face. "But you rest if you need to." Elsbeth shook her head, straightening her apron. "No, I'll help. The fresh air will do me good." Together they stepped out into the crisp mountain morning. The snow was beginning to retreat, leaving patches of dark earth exposed like islands in a white sea. Kevin showed her how to stack the logs properly on the sledge, his instructions punctuated by comfortable silences. As they worked, Elsbeth found herself humming an old hymn. The melody drifted up through the thin mountain air, mingling with the call of returning birds. Kevin joined in with his deep bass, and suddenly Elsbeth was laughing, at the joy of it, at the sheer unlikeliness of their path together. Her laughter startled a pair of snowbirds from a nearby pine. Kevin watched them wheel against the pale blue sky, a smile tugging at his mouth. Been a while since these mountains heard such happy sounds. They continued their work through the morning, taking breaks when Elsbeth needed them. Kevin never rushed her, never showed impatience. Instead, he used the pauses to tell her about the land, which trees would leaf first when spring truly arrived, where the best berry patches would bloom, how the meadow grasses would wave like a green sea in the summer wind. As the sun climbed higher, they carried armloads of split wood to stack against the cabin wall. Elsbeth loved these moments of shared labor, the way their movements fell into natural rhythm together. There was comfort in it, a sense of building something lasting. "I never thought I'd have this," she said softly as they finished the last stack. "A true home, I mean. Someone who—" She paused, searching for words. "Someone who sees you?" Kevin offered. "Yes." She brushed sawdust from her skirts. "My father always said no one would want me, that I was too much, too big, too plain, too willful." The old pain surfaced briefly in her voice. Kevin's face darkened at mention of her father's cruelty, but his touch remained gentle as he took her hand. He was wrong about everything that matters. As evening approached, they settled into their familiar spots by the fire, Kevin in his chair, Elsbeth in the one he'd crafted for her. The flames painted everything in warm gold, softening the cabin's rough edges. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, turning the snow-patched mountains to purple shadows. Elsbeth watched the fire dance, feeling more at peace than she had ever known. "I believe it now," she whispered. "Believe what?" "That I'm truly wanted." She turned to meet his gaze. "Not just tolerated or settled for, but wanted for myself." Kevin reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand. His voice was husky with emotion as he replied, "Wanted, cherished, and never forsaken. That's God's truth." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire settled lower, casting long shadows on the walls. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The snow on the nearest peaks had taken on a rose-gold tint, beautiful as promise. Spring was coming. They could feel it in the softening air, see it in the lengthening days, and the way the snow was retreating up the mountainsides. Soon the land would wake from its winter sleep, and with it, perhaps, new life would stir. But whatever the future held, they faced it together now. Two souls who had found in each other something stronger than their separate griefs. The cabin held them close in its wooden embrace as the last light faded from the western sky, leaving them in the warm circle of firelight, watching hope dawn on their shared horizon. The first breath of spring swept through the Colorado highlands, bringing with it the sweet chorus of mountain bluebirds. Snow lingered in shadowed hollows, but green shoots pushed through the warming earth, reaching for sunlight. The transformation of the land mirrored the change in Kevin and Elsbeth's hearts, winter's dormancy giving way to new life. On this particular Sunday morning, sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window as Elsbeth smoothed her best dress. She'd taken it in carefully over the winter months, her expert stitching making the fabric conform to her changing shape. The morning sickness had passed, leaving her with a gentle roundness that made Kevin's eyes soften whenever he looked at her. "Ready?" Kevin called from outside, where he was finishing with the horses. "Just a moment," she replied, pinning her cap in place. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from joyful anticipation. Kevin had hitched both horses to the wagon, though he usually rode his stallion separately. Today he wanted to sit beside her, he'd said. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, his huge hands gentle as always. The spring air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. As they rode toward Pine Crossing, Elsbeth noticed how different everything looked. The same winding trail that had seemed so forbidding months ago now felt familiar, almost welcoming. Young aspen leaves shimmered silver green in the morning light, and patches of early wildflowers dotted the meadows. "Remember that first trip to town?" she asked softly. Kevin nodded, his jaw tightening briefly at the memory. "Seems like another life now." "It was," she said, laying her hand on his arm. "We were different people then." The town came into view, its wooden buildings warmed by the morning sun. As they approached, Elsbeth noticed the changes here too. Where once there had been sidelong glances and whispered judgments, now people nodded in greeting. Several called out good morning as Kevin helped her down from the wagon. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife who had once sneered at Elsbeth's size, hurried over with a warm smile. "Saved you both seats near the front," she said, patting Elsbeth's arm. "Can't have you standing in your condition." Elsbeth blushed, still unused to such kindness, but Kevin's steady presence beside her gave her courage. They walked together into the small church, its white painted walls bright with spring sunshine. The wooden pews, worn smooth by years of faithful gathering, were already filling with families. As they settled into their seats, Elsbeth caught fragments of conversation around them. Not mockery now, but genuine warmth. "Those two were meant to find each other," she heard someone whisper. "God's timing is perfect." The service began with a familiar hymn, one Elsbeth had often sung alone in the cabin during those first uncertain days. Now her voice joined dozens of others, filling the small space with praise. Kevin's deep bass rumbled beside her, no longer shy about singing in public. Pastor Matthews spoke about new beginnings, about how God's mercy makes all things new. Elsbeth felt the words resonate in her soul, thinking of her own journey from despair to joy. Kevin's hand found hers during the sermon, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. When the final hymn ended, Kevin didn't rise to leave. Instead, he squeezed her hand and stood, addressing the pastor. "Begging your pardon, Reverend, but I have a request." The congregation fell silent, watching. Elsbeth's heart quickened as Kevin continued. "This woman beside me came to my door in winter's darkness, and with her came God's light back into my life." His voice, usually so reserved, carried clearly through the church. "We've been living as friends, as partners in work and prayer, but I'd like your blessing now to call her wife, proper and true before God and this community." Tears spilled down Elsbeth's cheeks as she stood beside him. This moment, this public declaration, was more than she'd ever dared hope for. The pastor's face broke into a wide smile as he descended from the pulpit. "Kevin Hale," he said warmly, "I've watched you emerge from grief's shadow these past months. And Elsbeth, my dear, you've shown us all what grace looks like in human form." He raised his hands over them. "It would be my joy to bless this union." The congregation broke into spontaneous applause, startling both Kevin and Elsbeth. Mrs. Peterson was openly weeping, and even some of the men were wiping their eyes. The pastor's wife hurried forward with her Bible, marked to the proper passage. The blessing itself was simple and profound. They spoke no elaborate vows, only promises to love and honor each other, to walk together in faith through whatever paths God set before them. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Kevin's kiss was gentle as snowfall, but it held all the warmth of spring sunshine. As people began to file out afterward, a group of children gathered around Elsbeth, pulling at her skirts. "Tell us another story," little Sarah Miller begged. "The one about the brave princess who wasn't afraid of the mountain giant?" Elsbeth laughed, settling onto a pew as the children clustered around her. She had begun telling them stories during church socials, weaving tales that celebrated courage in unexpected packages. Kevin stood back, watching with undisguised pride as she held her young audience spellbound. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice taking on the musical quality that always emerged when she told stories. "There was a princess who didn't look like other princesses. She was round as a full moon and shy as a forest deer." The children leaned in, entranced. Parents lingered in the doorway, smiling. Kevin's heart swelled as he watched his wife, sharing her gift of storytelling. He saw now what he'd recognized in her from the beginning. A spirit as vast as the mountains themselves, capable of containing both great sorrow and greater joy. The ride home was quiet but comfortable, both of them wrapped in the peace of the day. The setting sun painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold, and the evening air was sweet with the promise of spring flowers yet to bloom. Their cabin came into view just as dusk was settling, lamplight glowing warm and welcoming through the windows. Kevin had left a lamp burning that morning, knowing they'd return at day's end. That small consideration, planning for their return together, spoke volumes about how far they'd come. Inside, Kevin built up the fire, while Elsbeth changed from her church clothes. The familiar routine felt different now, sanctified by their public commitment. When she returned to the main room, Kevin was kneeling by the hearth, his father's Bible open before him. Elsbeth stood quietly, one hand resting on her growing belly, as Kevin's deep voice filled the cabin with prayer. But this time, his words held no plea for a son, no bargaining with God for an heir. Instead, he offered simple, profound thanks, for mercy that found them both in their loneliness, for love that saw beyond surface and circumstance, for the chance to begin again. When he finished praying, he rose and crossed to where she stood. His arms encircled her, strong and sure, and she leaned into his embrace. The firelight danced across the cabin walls, turning their shadows into one unified shape. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" "For seeing me. Truly seeing me, when I couldn't even see myself." Kevin's hand came up to cradle the back of her head, gentle as always despite his great size. "You taught me to see again," he said softly. "When grief had blinded me, you brought back the light." They stood together in the firelight, two souls who had found in each other something stronger than shame, deeper than despair. Through the cabin window, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The promise of faith, family, and love illuminated their shared future, bright as the lamplight that had guided Elsbeth home that first desperate night. In that moment, held in the circle of Kevin's arms, Elsbeth knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not despite her differences, but because of them. Not as a last resort, but as a first choice. Not as a means to an end, but as a cherished partner in all that lay ahead. The fire crackled softly, sending up sparks like prayers. Outside, a spring wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the last remnants of winter's darkness. Inside, in the warm circle of their embrace, love had finally found its true home. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.